Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, by Carroll Quigley. The Fall of France, May through June 1940, and the Vichy regime. In the next 6 months, neither victory nor survival seemed very likely for the West. The German forces, which had attacked on May 10th, were inferior in manpower to the forces which faced them, but were much more unified, used their equipment in an effective fashion, and had a single plan which they proceeded to carry out. Amounting to about 136 divisions, they were opposed by 156 divisions, but the defenders were divided into 4 different national armies, were arranged improperly, were given tasks too difficult for their size and equipment, and in general were so managed that their weakest points coincided completely with the most powerful German attacks. The French plan of campaign was dominated by 2 factors, the Maginot Line and Plan D. The Maginot Line, an elaborate and expensive system of permanent fortifications, ran from Switzerland to Montmedy. Behind this line, where they could not be used in the great battle drawing near, were stationed 62 of 102 French divisions on this frontier. From Montmedy to the sea, France had 40 divisions, plus the British Expeditionary Force of 10 divisions. According to Plan D, the anticipated German attack on the Low Countries was to be met by the Allied forces north of Montmedy, advancing as rapidly as possible to meet the enemy. If the Belgian army of 20 divisions were successful in holding up the German advance, it was hoped that a new Belgian-British-French line could be formed along the Dial River, or even 40 miles farther north along the Albert Canal. If the Belgian defense were less successful, the new line was to be formed along the Scheldt River, 50 miles behind the Dial. To carry out this rapid movement, as soon as the German attack was announced, the French placed their best and fastest divisions on the extreme left, in Henry Giraud's 7th Army, and their poorest divisions close to the end of the Maginot Line, in André Corrap's 9th Army, where they were expected to make a relatively short advance to take a position between Sedan and Namur, along the Meuse River. Once this Plan D advance into the Low Countries had been achieved, it was expected that the new line, from the sea to Longwy, deep in the Maginot Line, would stand as follows. Netherlands forces, 10 divisions. Giraud's 7th Army, 7 divisions. Belgian forces, 20 divisions. Lord Gort's British Expeditionary Force, 10 divisions. Jean Blanchard's 1st Army, 6 divisions. Corrap's 9th Army, 9 divisions. Charles Hunziger's 2nd Army, 7 divisions. Originally, the German plans were, as the French anticipated, a modified version of the Schlieffen Plan of 1905, involving a wide sweep through the Low Countries. The false alarms of a German attack in the winter of 1939 to 1940 revealed to the Germans, however, that the Allies would meet this attack by a rapid advance into Belgium. Accordingly, at the suggestion of General Erich von Manstein, the Germans modified their plans to encourage the Allied advance into Belgium, while the Germans planned to strike with their greatest strength at Sedan, the pivot of the Allied turning movement. Such an assault at Sedan made it necessary for the German forces to pass over the narrow, winding roads of the Ardennes forest, then to cross the deep and swift Meuse River, and to break between Corrap's and Hunziger's forces. But, if this could be done, and Sedan taken, excellent roads and a railroad ran from Sedan westward across France to the sea. Under the Manstein Plan, the German attack from the North Sea to Sedan was organized in 4 armies. In the north, the Netherlands was attacked by the German 18th Army, 1 panzer and 4 infantry divisions. In the middle, Belgium was attacked by the German 6th Army, 2 panzer and 15 infantry divisions, and the German 4th Army, 2 panzer and 12 infantry divisions. Farther south, in the Ardennes area, France was attacked by the German 12th Army, 5 panzer and 4 other divisions. From Sedan to Switzerland, although Germany had about 30 divisions, all were infantry formations and no major offensive was made. The Manstein Plan was a total surprise to the French. They were so convinced that the Ardennes were impassable for large forces, especially for tanks, that everything was done to make the German task easier. Korab and Hunziker placed their poorest forces, 6 Series B divisions, undermanned with little training, on either side of Sedan, and their best forces on their fronts most remote from the Ardennes, that is, from Sedan. In Hunziker's case, these better divisions were behind the Maginot Line itself. Because of the Ardennes, Korab gave his 4 poorest divisions near Sedan no anti-tank guns, no anti-aircraft guns, and no air support, reserving these for high-quality divisions 40 miles further north, and expected them to defend a front of 10 miles per division, while the French Third Army, deep behind the Maginot Line, had a front of 1.8 miles per division. Moreover, Korab's poor divisions were not stationed on the Meuse, but 2 days' march to the west of it, and were required, once the German attack began, to race the Germans to the intervening river. The German attack began at 5:35 on May 10th. 2 days later, the Panzer Division, with the German 18th Army, broke through the Dutch defenses and began to join up with parachute and airborne forces which had been dropped behind these. The Netherlands collapsed. The Dutch field forces surrendered on May 14th, after much of the center of Rotterdam had been destroyed in a 20-minute air attack. The Netherlands royal family and the government moved to England to continue the war. The great mass of the German attack fell on Belgium, and was greatly aided by the failure of many ordinary defensive precautions. Vital bridges over the Meuse and the Albert Canal were destroyed, only partly or not at all. The defenders on the Albert Canal were attacked from the rear by parachutists and glider forces, which had been landed behind them. The powerful fort on Eben Amiel, covering the canal bridges, was captured by airborne volunteers, who landed on its roof and destroyed its gun apertures with explosives. Belgium's forces fell backward toward the Dial as the French and British units, according to Plan D, wheeled northeastward on Sedan as a pivot to meet them. As the Belgian forces withdrew northwest, while the German attack swung southwest, the main burden of the German assault now fell on the French First Army to pin it down and thus prevent it from reinforcing Korab further south. In this, the Germans were successful. On May 15th, as news of the breakthrough at Sedan became known, Gamelin ordered all forces in Belgium to fall backward from the Dial line toward the Scheldt. The attack through the Ardennes on Korab's 9th Army was made by a special German force of 5 panzer and 3 motorized divisions under General Paul von Kleist. These passed through the forest and crossed the Meuse to fling themselves on the right side of Korab's inexperienced divisions. By the evening of May 15th, Korab's army had been volatilized, and the German spearhead was racing forward 35 miles west of Sedan. The misplaced French 6th Army, in reserve 300 miles south near Lyon, began to move toward the breach, while General Guillard, with 3 divisions from the 7th Army, was ordered from the extreme northwest, and 7 other divisions were taken from the forces behind the Maginot Line. All these arrived too late, because von Kleist's advanced units crossed France and reached the sea at Abbeville on May 20th, having covered 220 miles in 11 days. No coordinated attack was ever made on this thin, extended line, although orders were issued for it to be attacked both from the north and the south. The Allied forces retreating southward from Belgium were greatly hampered by masses of refugees clogging the roads, were constantly harassed by Stukas, and had lost communication between units. There was almost no contact or cooperation between the French, British, and Belgians in the north, or between these and the French forces south of Kleist's breakthrough. Panic swept Paris. On May 16th, 16 French generals, including Gamelin, were dismissed, and the command given to Weygand, who did not arrive from Syria until May 20th. During this period, evacuation of the government to Tours was ordered, and the secret archives of the Foreign Ministry were burned in bonfires on the lawns of the Quai d'Orsay. On May 17th, Renan replaced Daladier as Minister of the National Defense and generally shook up the government, replacing many weak men by defeatists, appeasers, and fascist sympathizers. The chief new face was that of Marshal Pétain. 83 years old, the man chiefly responsible for the inadequacy of French military planning in the interwar period. Pétain was recalled from the ambassadorship in Madrid to be vice premier in the new cabinet. Certain French politicians, including Pierre Leval, hoped that Pétain might play a role in French domestic politics such as Hindenburg had played in Germany, to protect the organized vested interests of industry and business from changes by the left in a period of defeat. Weygand spent 5 days, May 20th through May 25th, in an unsuccessful effort to get a coordinated attack on Kleist's salient. On May 25th through May 26th, Kleist, moving up the coast from the Somme on the rear of the northern Allied forces, captured Boulogne and Calais, leaving Dunkirk as the only major port on the Allied rear. Withdrawal to this port was threatened by a German breakthrough the Belgian army toward Ypres. On May 27th, King Leopold of Belgium made an unconditional surrender of his armies to the Germans, over the objections of the Belgian civil government, and without making certain that the Allied command had been informed. The British Expeditionary Force at once began to evacuate the continent through Dunkirk. In 7 days, using 887 watercraft of all types and sizes, 337,131 men were taken off the beaches at Dunkirk under relentless air bombardment, May 28th through June 4th. By Hitler's direct order, no intensive ground attack was made on the Allied forces within the Dunkirk perimeter, as Hitler was convinced that Britain would make peace as soon as France was defeated, and wished to save his dwindling armored forces and munitions for the attack on the rest of France. In the interval before this new attack, Weygand tried to form a new line along the Somme and Aisne rivers, from the sea to the Maginot Line, and to eliminate 3 bridgeheads the Germans already held south of the Somme. The Battle of France began on June 5th with German attacks on the western and eastern ends of the Weygand Line. By June 8th, the western end had been broken, and German forces began to move to the rear of the Somme defenses. As the line collapsed and the military forces fell back, they disintegrated among packed masses of civilian refugees, hurried onward by German dive bombers. Paris, and later all cities of France, were declared open cities, not to be defended, Just as in Kleist's original breakthrough, no effort was made to hold up the Germans by road obstacles, civilian resistance, house-to-house fighting, destruction of supplies, or, above all, destruction of abandoned gasoline. The German armored units roamed at will on captured fuel. On June 12th, Weygand requested the French government to seek an armistice. Renan refused to permit any civilian surrender, since this was forbidden by an Anglo-French agreement of March 12, 1940. Instead, he gave permission for military capitulation if the civilian government continued the war from French North Africa or from overseas bases, as Norway, the Netherlands, and Belgium were doing. Pétain, Weygand, and their supporters refused to leave France. They also flatly rejected any military capitulation, for they wanted to end the fighting with an armistice which would allow France to maintain a French army as a guarantee against any economic or social changes in France. There was also considerable pressure behind the scenes from anti-democratic French industrialists in monopolistic lines such as chemicals, light metals, synthetic fibers, and electrical utilities. These industrialists, together with politicians like Laval and private or commercial banks like the Banque Worms or the Banque d'Indochine, had been negotiating cartel and other agreements with Germany for 10 years, and felt an armistice would offer a splendid opportunity to complete and enforce these agreements. As the military collapse continued, piteous appeals for help were sent to London and to Washington. Renan sent 18 messages to Churchill asking for more air support, but could obtain none, as the British War Cabinet wished to save all the planes it still had for the defense of Britain after the French collapse. Appeals to Roosevelt were no more successful. 150 planes and 2,000 75mm cannons were sent, but they sailed from Halifax only on June 17th and were at sea when the fighting ceased. The chief concern in London and Washington was over the fate of the French fleet and of French North and West Africa, especially Dakar. If Hitler obtained the French fleet or any considerable portion of it, British and American security would be in acute jeopardy. The French fleet was of high quality and included 2 new battleships, Richelieu and Jean Bart, which had just been built but were not yet in service. Such a navy, in combination with the German and Italian navies, might destroy Britain's sea defenses and force a British surrender. This would place America in great danger, as American security in the Atlantic had been preserved by the British fleet since 1818, and by 1940 the whole American battle fleet had to be kept in the Pacific to face Japan. Only less immediate than these dangers were the threat to both British and American security from a German occupation of French North and West Africa. These would close the British route through the Mediterranean immediately and would allow the Italian forces in Libya to invade Egypt with relative impunity. The possession of Dakar by German forces would provide a base from which submarines could attack the British route to the east by way of South Africa, and might permit an attack on Brazil, only 1,700 miles west of Dakar. With these considerations in mind, Washington and London did all they could to dissuade Mussolini from attacking France, and to persuade the French to avoid any armistice which might yield either French Africa or the French fleet to Hitler. Eventually, Britain gave permission to France to seek an armistice if the fleet sailed to British ports. This was rejected by the French military and naval authorities. As a final effort, Churchill, on June 16th, offered France a political union with Britain, involving joint Anglo-French citizenship and a joint cabinet. this was never considered by the French. As the military debacle continued to grow and Renan would not make a separate peace and could not get a cabinet agreement to withdraw overseas, he resigned June 16th and was replaced by a new government, headed by Marshal Pétain. The old man, surrounded by defeatists and appeasers, who had been intriguing for deals with the Nazis for years, at once asked for an armistice and issued an ambiguous public statement which led some French units to cease fighting immediately. On June 10th, Italy had declared war, but was unable to make any important military advances against French resistance. On June 14th, the Germans entered Paris. The French government, having moved to Tours on June 11th and continuing to Bordeaux on June 15th. The armistice negotiations were conducted in the same railway carriage at the Campagne, in the forest of Raton, where Germany had surrendered in 1918. They took 3 days and went into effect on June 25th. Hitler was so convinced that Britain would also make peace that he gave surprisingly lenient terms to France. In spite of Mussolini's demands, France did not have to give up any overseas territory or any ports on the Mediterranean, no naval vessels or any aeroplanes or armaments to be used against England. Northern France and all the western coast to the Pyrenees came under occupation, but the rest was left unoccupied, ruled by a government free from direct German control and policed by French armed forces. The chief burden of the surrender came from 3 provisions. 1. The division of the country into 2 zones, with about 2/3 of French productive capacity in the occupied zone. 2. All French prisoners of war, amounting to almost 2 million men, were to remain in German hands until the final peace treaty, while German prisoners were to be released at once. And 3. All the expenses of the German occupation were to be paid by unoccupied France. The 2 zones were sealed off so completely that even postal communication was reduced to a minimum. This crippled the economy of the unoccupied part. The expenses of the army of occupation were set at the outrageous sum of 400 million francs a day. Moreover, by fixing the exchange rate at 1 Reichsmark for 20 francs, in place of the pre-war rate of 1 for 11 francs, it became possible for the occupying forces to buy goods very cheaply in France, thus draining wealth to Germany. The governmental system of Vichy France was a kind of bureaucratic tyranny. Pierre Lvov pushed through a series of constitutional laws which ended the Third Republic and the parliamentary system, combining in the hands of Marshal Pétain the joint functions of head of the state, formerly held by the president, and head of the government, formerly held by the prime minister, with the right to legislate by decree. Laval was designated as Pétain's successor in holding these powers, and the parliamentary chambers were dismissed. In spite of this appearance of centralized authority, the government as a whole operated on the basis of whim and intrigue, the various ministers following mutually inconsistent policies and seeking to extend these by increasing their influence over Pétain. The procrastinations, suspicions, ambiguities, and secrecies of the marshal himself make it difficult to determine what his own policy was, or even if he had one. It seems likely that he followed various policies simultaneously, allowing his legal powers to be exercised by quite dissimilar subordinates, in an effort to achieve a few clearly defined aims. These aims seem to have been 4 in number, in decreasing importance. 1. To maintain at all costs the independence of unoccupied France. 2. To secure the release as rapidly as possible of the prisoners of war. 3. To reduce the financial charges of the occupation forces. And 4. To reduce, bit by bit, the barriers between the occupied and unoccupied zones. The ideology of Vichy was a typical fascist mélange of nationalism, social solidarity, anti-Semitism, anti-democracy, anti-communism, opposition to class conflicts, to liberalism, or to secularism, with resounding blasts of the virtues of discipline, self-sacrifice, authority, and repentance. But all these things meant very little either to the rulers or the ruled of the new regime. In general, corruption and intrigue, idealism and self-sacrifice were about as prevalent under Vichy as they had been under the Third Republic. But secrecy was more successful. Civil liberties were absent. The distance between propaganda and behavior was, if anything, wider, and hypocrisy replaced cynicism as the chief vice of politicians. The two strongest characteristics of the regime, which made it sufficiently solid to continue to function, were negative ones: hatred of the Third Republic and hatred of England. But these ideas were too negative and too remote from the problems of day-to-day existence to provide very satisfactory guides to Vichy policy. As a result, there was complete confusion of policy. Some leaders, and these the less influential, like Weygand, were resolutely anti-German, and were patiently awaiting the day when Vichy could turn against the German conquerors. Others, and these the more influential, like Laval or Admiral Darlan, had faith in a final German victory over Britain, and felt that France must accept the inevitable hegemony of Germany, but try to secure for itself a privileged position as favorite satellite. While Pétain's personal views were probably closer to those of Weygand, his pessimistic and defeatist personality led him to embrace the other point of view as a necessary evil. Accordingly, under German pressure, he removed Weygand from all participation in public life, November 1941, and accepted Laval and later Darlan as his chief advisers and designated successors. In this situation, Darlan had an advantage over Laval, in view of Pétain's personal inclinations, for Laval was a wholehearted and frank advocate of collaboration with Hitler, while Darlan was a much more devious and ambiguous personality, and thus closer to Pétain's own character and policy. Accordingly, Laval was named foreign minister and successor in July 1940, but was removed from office as unduly pro-German on December 13, 1940. Darlan, who had been Minister of the Navy, became Foreign Minister, Vice Premier, Minister of the Interior, Successor Designate, and Chief Advisor to Pétain in February 1941, and held these positions until April 1942. At that date, Hitler forced Pétain to make Laval head of the government, with full powers in both internal and external affairs. The policy of Vichy France can hardly be called a success under Pétain, Darlan, or Laval. Some of the basic assumptions on which the regime had been founded proved to be false. Britain did not surrender. Efforts to collaborate with Hitler did not succeed in releasing the prisoners of war, in reducing the costs of occupation, or in lowering the barriers between the two zones of France. More than 1 million prisoners were still in German hands in January 1944. In addition, large numbers of French civilians were forced to go to labor in Germany, in spite of all kinds of resistance. The number of these reached 650,000 by late 1943. The occupation payments were reduced from 400 million to 300 million francs a day in May 1942, but were increased again to 500 million in November 1942, and finally to 700 million a day in July 1944. In 45 months, to April 1944, France paid 536 million francs of these charges. Such payments resulted in a completely unbalanced budget and extreme inflation. Futile efforts to control this inflation by price fixing, wage fixing, and rationing gave rise to enormous black market transactions and widespread corruption, to the great profit of both German and Vichy officials. The latter did not even retain the satisfaction of believing that the armistice had preserved the integrity of France and of its empire, for Alsace-Lorraine was in fact, if not in law, annexed to Germany, and most of the overseas empire fell out of Vichy control in 1942. Lorraine was Germanized, and those inhabitants who remained loyal to France or to French culture were persecuted and exiled, hundreds of thousands coming as refugees to unoccupied France. The continued resistance of Britain, the treatment of Alsace-Lorraine, the growing economic strain, and, above all, Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union in June 1941 led to the growth of an anti-German underground resistance in France. Russia's involvement in the war shifted the communists throughout the world, as if by magic, from a pro-German anti-war policy to an anti-German pro-war policy. Their discipline and fanaticism gradually made them the dominant influence in the resistance in France and elsewhere in Europe. British and American policies toward Vichy France, as toward Franco-Spain or neutral Russia, were parallel but far from identical. London, which broke off diplomatic relations with the new French regime in June 1940, followed a severe policy, but at the same time sought to win France back into some kind of anti-Nazi resistance. Vichy weakness made this a hopeless task. At the same time, London tried to build up General de Gaulle as leader of the Free French into a diluted French government in exile, although de Gaulle's uncooperative personality and arrogant pride made this a difficult and unpalatable task. De Gaulle obtained little support in the French Empire and almost none in France itself, but continued to enjoy a certain measure of British support. In Washington, on the other hand, de Gaulle obtained almost no support. The United States continued to recognize the Vichy regime, with Roosevelt sending Admiral Leahy as his personal representative to Pétain, and Robert Murphy as his special agent in North Africa. In general, the United States encouraged France, offered certain economic concessions, especially in North Africa, and sought little more than steadfast adherence to the armistice terms and continued withholding of the fleet and empire from Nazi hands. Both the United States and Britain made numerous secret and special agreements with various representatives of the Vichy government, but achieved very little. An agreement of February 26, 1941, between Robert Murphy and General Reagan, did allow the United States, in return for certain commercial promises, to maintain consular observers in North Africa. These observers obtained large amounts of valuable military and economic information for the United States and Britain during the months preceding the Allied invasion of North Africa on November 8, 1942.